So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start with something that is a bit new to Spaces, and so I'm just going to go ahead and start off with our land acknowledgement. So this is something that was recently introduced here, and we're really planning and hoping that this is something that becomes a very important part of our programmatic structure moving forward. So Spaces recognizes the land upon which our building resides as the ancestral homeland of the Lenape or Delaware tribe, the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Miami, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Haudenosaunee, and other Great Lakes tribes, including but not limited to the Chippewa, the Kickapoo, the Weya, the Piankeshaw, and the Kaskaskia. We further acknowledge the thousands of indigenous people who now call this region home as a result of forced migration, dispossession of ancestral homelands and territories, or other reasons. We affirm their right as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. We make this statement recognizing that, intentionally or not, we have participated in ongoing settler colonialism, a term that is generally recognized to mean the removal, erasure, and supplantation of indigenous peoples. We commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. So thank you for joining us. And to provide a little bit of information about Spaces, we are the resource and public forum for artists who explore and experiment. We are the only alternative arts organization in Ohio that solely commissions new artist projects, serving as a national model for how to materialize artist ideas and interact with audiences. Our success is rooted in providing artists the kind of support rarely seen outside of major institutions, which has led to ambitious new projects that have reached an international stage and expanded artists' practices. So I'm Tizziana Baldenebro. I am the executive director here at Spaces. And to ID my appearance, I am a Latina woman and I'm wearing clear acetate glasses and I have wavy black hair and I'm wearing a gray shirt and a gold chain. I'm here with artists Alicia Gruyon and Leo Salvaggio. Alicia Gruyon has been in residency at Spaces since November, the result of which is her exhibition Please Don't Let It Be Too Close, which is now on view. A 2018 and 19 artist in residence at the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics at New York University, she directs her interdisciplinary practice towards critiques of the politics of presence, arguing for inclusion of disenfranchised communities in political and social spheres. She is a co-organizer and co-author of the People's Cultural Plan, a coalition of artists, cultural workers, and activists responding to New York City's first ever cultural plan. Her work has been shown at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, El Museo del Barrio, Columbia University's Wallach Art Gallery, Brick Arts, Spring Break Art Show, and Performa 11, among others. Gruyon is also a contributing author to Rhetoric, Social Value, and the Arts, but How Does It Work?, edited by Nicola Mann and Charlotte Bonham Carter, which is available via Palgrave Macmillan, and Bridging Communities Through Socially Engaged Art, edited by Alice Wexler and Vita Sabagi, also available on Routledge. Recent activities include the Shandaken Project, inaugural artist residency on Governor's Island, and the Bronx Museum of the Arts AIM alum program at 80 White Street. Gruyon is an adjunct professor of the School of Visual Arts and the City University of New York. So if you want to briefly ID yourself and say hi.
Hi everyone. I am a woman of color. I have black hair, and I am wearing a hoodie that has like pink and orange leopard print on the outside, and on the inside it's a cream colored kind of Sherpa comfiness that I'm wrapped up in. My hair is up, and yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, that's perfect. And so Leo Selvaggio, who is also here today, is an interdisciplinary artist and designer whose work examines the entanglement of identity and technology within the context of civic action. He has exhibited in France, Canada, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and broadly in the US. Selvaggio's work has been featured in Business Week, Hyperallergic, TechCrunch, The Washington Post, CNET, The Verge, and others. His work is included in various collections, including the Spy Museum and the Wend Museum in the U.S. Selvaggio's writing can be found in several publications, including the International Journal for Performance Arts and the recent book, The Evolution of the Image, Political Action and the Digital Self. He holds a BFA from Rutgers University and an MFA from Columbia College's Interdisciplinary Arts program. He currently serves as an instructional media technologist for the Media Labs at Brown University. So Leo, if you would like to briefly say hi and visually identify yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Leo. I use he, him pronouns. I am a cisgendered, queer, white presenting man. I have purple hair. I'm wearing audacious glasses, a multicolored scarf wrapped around my neck. Just imagine someone fabulous, and that's me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for that, and thank you all for joining us here today. So we're going to go straight right into the questions. I know for many of you haven't seen the shows. So Leo's show is available sort of like in a virtual form. So it is a Snapchat filter, and you're welcome to submit videos using the hashtag #ApologizeToAmerica. Snapchat is a very readily downloadable social media app. There's a Spaces account now, so you can follow us. And Alicia's show is available in our galleries, and so it's this really exciting result of a residency that she has been doing virtually, remotely from New York, and so trying to explore Cleveland from a great distance. So let's get into our questions. And so at the very end, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, as Layla said. We'll also be saving some space at the end of the event to allow some audience questions. So the first question that I have is that you both tackle the function of the individual and civic action in incredibly unique ways. For example, Alicia, you stitch together individual narratives to produce a larger narrative that is performed seamlessly. And Leo, you imbue the individual with the authority, or I guess in this case the former authority, of the presidency, which is the most visible individual role in the country. So I was wondering if you could both talk about how your practice relates to the idea of the individual to broader social narratives.
Leo, I'm gonna go first. I'm sorry, we probably should have decided before. Who's gonna go first? Yeah, thanks for that question. And I'm going to start just by talking very briefly about my practice, because I think my practice informs, well, at least for me, informs this question when we consider the individual within social narratives. So, I mean, in my work, I put my body in situations that historically have not been meant for me, or designed so that I have little control over how I am represented in them. Mm-hmm. And by which I mean my body as a signifier. So how do I read as, a light-skinned Afro-Caribbean Latinx person when I walk into a room? I'm a cis woman. So how does that all read? And the signification that my body carries is going to vary depending on who's doing the looking and who's doing the interpreting. Mm-hmm. And that's largely due to the gaze, and more specifically, the colonial patriarchal gaze, as opposed to the oppositional gaze that we know that writers like Bell Hooks writes about. So when I'm thinking of the individual, I'm thinking of ideas that Stuart Hall has put forth in regards to identity. Mm-hmm. And how, in these critical practices, at least in my critical practice, I cannot separate the individual from this social narrative. The individual is part of that social narrative, and often is affected in different ways depending on who is doing the narrating, and the social narrative found in that particular place. So in my practice, I embody. It's kind of a type of research that I do. How does the narrative change when I'm the one, in the case of my work, where I often do reenactments? Mm-hmm. That's where my performance work is based on, largely. Reenactments of stories that are told to me or shared with me as they are told to me. Mm-hmm. So how does all that change? How does that story change, and how do I relate to that story when I'm aware of how my body has been objectified twice, right, as a woman of color? So there are two objectifications going on. So how does that change? How does that change the meta narrative that, in particular, in modern world, particularly in the Western world, the meta narrative is often guided by or assumed to be a white narrative. How does that story change? How do we save these stories when that meta narrative is different? So how does that affect the individual story, but in large part in relationship to that social narrative? I hope that makes sense.
No, it totally does make sense. And Layla pulled up the picture that you have, one of the works. I think this one's called May 8th, 2020. And it's one of the images that you have in the gallery right now of you dressed as, I guess, is this a nurse or a doctor or therapist, where you're sort of dressed and you're sitting on your couch and staring quite plainly into the camera, but it's a really interesting embodiment because it sort of serves as this kind of like metonym for the like larger 2020, like trying to interpret this before a 2020 mindset was possible. Yes. I think is like really kind of like an interesting challenge because now it becomes such a different signifier for all of these kinds of things that have since occurred, because doctors and nurses were always wearing surgical masks, but now the sort of like presence of this in the home setting has such a different meaning. I think it's really quite beautiful and fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't want to take too much time because I know Leo has to actually, but I want to
No, not at all, Alicia. That was really fascinating, and it was interesting to hear your take, because I think we have two similar points of origin, but maybe different departures, in the sense that I have been very, my work is very kind of directed by this idea of ways of seeing. In fact, one of my favorite books is Ways of Seeing by John Berger. And in it, he talks about this idea that like, once you are able to see, you realize that you are also seen, and that both your vision and the vision of this other person or these other people combine to create a kind of I don't want to say justification, but like a kind of proof that you exist in this visual world, right? And so for me, there's a kind of reciprocal nature of seeing that applies to identity, and that's something that I've always been working on in my work as well, is this idea of what does identity and authorship mean, especially in light of our new relatively new social media context, in which I would argue that authorship of our identities, with data mining and marketing companies creating all these profiles about us, that it's becoming so much more distributed. And that our ability to think of identity as just our own outward-facing presentation of who we are to the world just doesn't quite exist anymore, not the way that it used to. And so for me, I've been thinking a lot about, or I should say that my creative research and practice has taken me from thinking about my own identity, which, because like my own identity is what I have to work with, right? Like I have it, I own it, I can do things with it. But going from thinking of my own identity as material for people to use. And so there was this one project called yourme.net, in which I published all of my social media handles and passwords and invited the public to, tweet as me, Facebook as me, create new relationships for me, destroy them, however you're going to use them. And really thinking about this idea is that I wanted to make tangible this idea of curating identity, constructing it for digital presentation, to then moving into this idea of identity as technology, or identity as an externalization of the self, that has its own place kind of in the world. One example of that is a project that I had called Your Me Surveillance, which is a facial recognition anti-surveillance project in which I created a 3D printed prosthetic of my mask, a 3D printed prosthetic mask of my face, and invited the public to wear it in surveilled areas so that when they were tagged, it was me that was tagged as opposed to themselves. And so I have been thinking a lot about this idea of kind of extrapolating or distancing the idea of how we think about identity as an individual thing and expanding it out more into this container or technology that can be filled by other people. That and I think Alicia, you mentioned the word signifier, and I would say that in very many ways I am thinking about that way too. But I think because technology, I work with technology, thinking of it as a technology is just a slightly different framework for me. And so, yeah. So for me, I think that there's this interplay between the individual and society, and we're constantly all part of creating that individual, and vice versa. Which I know sounds a little vague, but there's an interconnectedness. So like a lot of times these conversations, pit individual versus society or individual versus community. But in many ways, as an example from my personal life, I'm very white presenting, but I grew up in a Colombian family who wanted me to become very Americanized. And so I noticed that I had this kind of adopted white male identity that like I fully embrace now, like I am white. But for the longest time, I tried to assert my Colombian identity into a community and a society that would only ever see me as white. Even some of my best friends, when I pick up the phone and start speaking Spanish to my mom, they're like, what? Like, and they've known me for years.
Yeah.
And they know that I assert this. So
no,
where
I think that that's actually like such a great part about it, because like, when you have the filter on, it's like this kind of expectation that somehow you start to adopt Donald Trump's mannerisms, even though they're like, you could have like a Colombian accent when you're talking, or, like whatever your own affect is. Like I can't change my voice, but I sort of like start to emulate the sort of speech patterns and stuff. But I think that actually feeds in really perfectly to our other question, to sort of the second question that we have. So because you sort of state that the filter is intentionally not a deep fake. So verisimilitude or its absence is a thread, I think, that exists in both of your projects. But this filter in particular touches into this technological moment of mimicry. So the TikToks, the Snapchats, and the way that sort of like lip syncing is, again, sort of like part of the digital culture. And here are some images that Layla and I were just messing around with earlier of us using these kinds of Snapchat filters. So yeah, I mean, I think, can you talk about the purpose or intention of a filter that sort of is meant to sort of be me, but not me, and how it feeds into this larger project of accountability through embodiment?
Yes, that's a great question. First and foremost, I was not interested in making a deep fake because I don't want to create a piece of media that Trump supporters in 5-10 years or even now could point to and be like, see, he apologized. Like, no, I don't want to create anything convincing that helps this man's kind of reputation towards reconciliation. Not that I think he's ever going to move that way. And that's in part one of the reasons I'm doing this project. But in terms of like why the filter, there's some obvious answers to that. The first is that social media is so, omnipotent at this point. And I like creating works that are as democratically accessible as possible. And so the idea that Snapchat, it could be a filter that almost anyone with a smartphone, or even if they don't have a smartphone, a laptop, would be able to access was really, really important to me. But conceptually, I think it's more about what happens with the filter. So with the filter, the portions that are the face, it doesn't just digitally transplant Trump's features onto your face. It maps it out onto your existing facial structure. So it's Trump, but it's also not Trump. It's this kind of synthesis between the two people. Or if, to kind of use a slightly political term, a union between the president and its people. And so to me, that idea of that digital embodiment, that was really significant to me. This idea that you could be apologizing, and it's kind of this union between the president and his actions by reaffirming the travesties that he has committed, combined directly with the person or people that have been affected by it, coming together in this digital union of sorts. And that, I think, is why it can be a bit of an emotional experience, because it's not this passive thing. You are taking on this identity that has hurt you, and using it as a kind of call to action, if you will. So the embodiment there, I think, is really, really important. And the fact that many people can use it or do it is just kind of icing on the cake. I love that this project lives, on the internet, if you will, instead of elsewhere. I think we need that kind of global type of thing for stuff like this right now.
Yeah, and it has this sort of like really interesting idea of being able to sort of like branch out in this kind of like, tentacular way, as to borrow from the xenofeminists. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Alicia, you also use embodiment quite extensively, although in a sort of like inverse way. Through your interviews, you capture specific body tics, body movements, intonations. I mentioned that it's very Aristotelian, this idea that the most basic human art is mimicry, right? And so you also craft these intentionally sort of like glitched images of verisimilitude. So it's not like you're trying to exactly reproduce what you hear in the interview or what you see in the interview, but you're actually trying to craft some sort of like other larger narrative from these kinds of stories. So, for example, there are ways in which the green screen bleeds into your image, or your dog is jumping just when you take the photograph. Can you tell us about how you view embodiment within your practice as you're starting to meet and interview with people for your work?
It goes back to what I had like previously talked about in regards to how does the narrative change when I'm the one telling the story. I did a piece. I did an 11-hour reenactment of Senator Wendy Davis's 2013 filibuster. And if you don't remember, the filibuster was to stop a Texas bill that would have closed down all but 5 women's clinics in the state, and that would have had a tremendous effect on the health of mostly poor working class women in Texas. And if you've ever visited Texas, it's huge, it's humongous. So driving to the nearest clinic would have been devastating for many women. So I did that piece well aware that I wasn't embodying Wendy Davis. I did, if you don't know who Wendy Davis is, Senator Davis, she's a cisgendered European descendant. She has blonde hair, and
pink sneakers. Right?
Yeah, and great pink sneakers. And we don't look alike. We don't look alike at all. So I was very very aware of the history of reproduction health, and specifically in the country that we're in the United States. And I was born and raised here. She was born and raised here. But when we look at reproductive health within this country, in regards to women, it will change dramatically based on who that woman is, right? So when I'm thinking of women of color, but specifically Black women, and forced sterilization practices, right? Or forced sterilization practices that happened in the Latinx community. And, we won't even look at, or we could look at actually the forced sterilization that has happened to the migrant women who are coming into the United States, just, in the fall that was exposed. So when I'm talking about reproductive health, there's an added layer of history to it. So when I did that performance, I wasn't embodying her, but I was definitely wanting the viewer, wanting whoever was listening to look at and consider the larger history of reproduction, of reproductive health amongst women in this country, and how I could stand in for not the women, but stand in for that change of perspective, or for the opening up of that conversation more broadly. And I don't think it's interesting that you talk about mimicry, because there were some instances when I was interviewing some people, there were some gestures that people made that were just fantastic. So as a performer, sometimes I will, some things that were really fantastic, I wanted to mimic, so that it wouldn't just be me at every point speaking. And we could get into a whole different discussion with different performance artists, right? Well, you're rehearsing it. And I'm like, well, I'm not rehearsing it, but how much of this could you take without realizing that's another story that you're hearing from someone else? Or how much could I take as a performer, like listen to myself do the same thing without changing some aspects of my mannerisms in order to retell this story. And then mimicry also helps in regards to my relationship to that story. Because we're all in relationship with each other. We're all in relationship with these social narratives. And if you take it a step further, we ourselves are embodied sensory experiences, and, how I regard it, aka a story. So how do I relate to that? How do I relate to this other person's stories, and to their embodied experiences, understanding that I may not have experienced it directly, but I'm in a position of retelling it, and capturing time, if you will, in the few moments that I'm sharing.
No, I think that's really wonderful. Thank you both. I think these ideas of embodiment are really being examined, especially right now when we're sort of like in this kind of nexus of like, how are we perceived? How do we perceive? How do we come back from what we've been, like all of these kinds of ideas that we're all sort of trying to explore right now really do have a lot to do with perception and embodiment, I think, which is why I think these projects actually like are kind of fun together in this weird way. But these projects actually both could have been completely different had the results of the election been reversed. And I know that these projects were already sort of in the works before the elections were ended. And in fact, Alicia, the title of your show is so anticipatorily prescient. Like, please don't let it be too close. It's like begging. Because it was actually a lot closer, I think, than we initially thought it was going to be. I think the pollsters were saying that it was going to be like a wipeout, and then day of, everyone was biting their nails and watching the TV, and like we actually didn't even find out the results until a week later. And then to have you also be able to capture that same footage of the Capitol riots in your work, that you were sort of like updating, you were sort of like, no, this needs to be included in the film. So I'm thinking, about how both of you were sort of approaching your projects and your practices, and what you were thinking or feeling, either as the residents or as the project progressed during the election cycle. Yeah.
It wasn't what I was expecting.
I don't think it was for anyone.
I mean, I planned this 2 years in advance, and I remember a conversation I had with Megan, who's part of Spaces,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember talking to her about it in 2018. You know, and that was my proposal after being nominated for an artist in residency, and to be in Cleveland. So I was anticipating some differences. You know, I was raised in New York City, and what interested me on doing this project was spending time in the Midwest, spending time in areas that may have had a completely different. There's my dog.
It's okay.
A completely different. I'm just gonna talk right over her.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. Don't worry. Talk right over your dog.
of looking or considering the election, and that was of great interest to me. So yeah, I mean, I don't. There's some parts that I could not. You can't make it up, right? You can't make some things up. I mean, it's the incredible amount of twists and turns. And by the way, please don't let it be too close. Please let the results come in quickly. Is the full is actually a sort of like little quote unquote prayer that some poll workers make and have made for a while. So that is coming from that particular bit of research that I found really interesting and had in mind. And
I hadn't heard that. That's really a really interesting sort of subtext to it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my last remark before Leo answers for him, you know, is that it was interesting that during my interviews there was one of the consistencies with the majority of people that I interviewed was I'm not going to say surprise, but I guess there was almost like a letdown. Let's just use that word, a letdown, that even before the election started, because I started these interviews we had mail-in. I started before the mail-in ballots were going, or started being mailed in. Mm-hmm. And then some interviews that I conducted as the mail-in ballots were being counted. And the letdown that it was so close after everything that had occurred these last 4 years, and that was quite palpable in many of the people that I interviewed with. And then at that point in time in the fall, after everything that had been happening in 2020, and still in the middle of quarantine, yeah, right? And after massive protest yet again. So it's like it was just kind of let down. Yeah. That was shared.
Yeah, that rings so true, Alicia, because my project came from a different kind of place. It wasn't nearly as planned out as yours was, and I was reacting directly to that idea of feeling let down. This idea popped in my head like in December, when even after we had heard that he was going to not be president. I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it up until Inauguration Day was done. And so so I think in many respects, that letdown and that realization of like, how could it be this close? I think that was a real spur for me. And so I think that the project would have gone on whether he won whether he continued or not. um, in the sense that like, well, let me say this. I think that now that Trump is not president, that the idea of holding him accountable seems more real to people, as opposed to when he was in the position of presidency. Regardless of, like, he needs to be held accountable, period. But the idea that it could actually happen. And one of the things that I was really concerned about from seeing my friends reacting on Facebook and having conversations was that people were just so happy to have him out. They just wanted to like stop there, like, like nightmares over, like let's just go and just be like back to the way that we used to be. And there was a fundamental part of me that was like, no, we need to follow this through. He needs to be indicted. He needs to be he needs to he needs to be put to jail. And I think that like it's such a balance between healing, because we all need to heal from this trauma that we have had for ostensibly for the last 4 years, but certainly for many communities, people of color, much longer than that. But at the same time, I didn't want to lose momentum. And so this project is kind of a speculative fantasy of what would happen if he actually were accountable, because I don't know. We don't know. He probably will just become a news correspondent pundit on Fox or get his own cable channel or something, because we've seen it happen too many times in the past with politicians who do these grievous acts and continue to be millionaires and what have you. So I think in terms of like how would it changed if the election, I mean, I don't know that it probably wouldn't have existed if it weren't, because it technically it started after the election, but.
Gotcha. No, but I think that brings up sort of this other question that I had, which is that your title, Apologize to America, suggests that it is America as a nation that is owed an apology. But of course, the protests of Black Lives Matter, the indigenous activists, and other anti-racist groups and orgs would argue that America is the one that needs to do the apology. And I know that you had sort of discussed this earlier on about the collective being the individual and individual being the collective, but, not to keep bringing up the classics, but this idea of the Leviathan, that was a Hobbesian idea, that we are all arms of the state, have each played a role in whatever the country is. Thinking about the Capitol riots and how all of the talking heads, Biden went up and said this is not who we are, but many Black, brown, LGBTQIA, indigenous folks, the list is really long, they would all say that this is absolutely who we are.
Yes.
So yeah, do you have any thoughts on the function of an apology in this project?
Absolutely. And that's such a wonderful question. An apology does not begin to cover what needs to happen. There's no question about that. I am all for reparations, defunding the police, all kinds of reform. We definitely need to do this work. Speaking of Hobbes' Leviathan, one of the interesting things about, that text is, it's one of the precursors, if not like, the generator of social contract theory, right? And so in that metaphor, the people create the body of this Leviathan, right? But the sovereign is the head, right? The sovereign is supposed to be the one person that takes on this corporealness and, executes the will of the people, right? And so there's something about having to, as much as we need to look inward into all of the institutions that need to be dismantled. There is a signifying and symbolic thing about the sovereign, the person that we have trusted, who has broken our sense of social contract, that needs, in my mind, to be held accountable. So while an apology is not enough, there's something about Trump issuing an apology that is so unimaginable that it becomes kind of like a fantasy to even speculate, like, what would it be like if he actually said those words? And so it's a very small thing. And again, not enough, but we can't even seem to get that, right? So to start from that place, I'm very inspired by other tactical media projects that have had some kind of success with this, right? I'm thinking specifically of the Yes Men, where if for those that aren't familiar with the Yes Men, they are a performative tactical media group that essentially take on the role of an institution or a company that has done wrong, and they claim liability for it. It's a total farce, but they'll go like onto a news and say like, yes, for an example, the BP oil spill. They went on and they said, yes, we're executives from BP. We take full responsibility. We will be setting up a $2 billion relief fund. We will be doing this, and that. And then you find out that it was a hoax, but everyone still, after hearing it, everyone's still like, but that is what BP should do.
Yeah.
And so then BP had to do it,
Yeah.
from a PR standpoint, right? And so they have been able to actually kind of force, these larger than life kind of institutions and companies and structures to do this thing. And so part of my project is a kind of like communal building of an archive of these things that should happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe when we see them and we do them, maybe we'll ask, well, why aren't they? Why aren't they? And let's make it happen somehow. So it is by all means like not a it's a Band-Aid in the worst way. But it's also, I think it can have the potential to do something. It really depends on, I think it depends on the community that invests in the project and does it, because I'm not really creating a work of art so much as I'm creating a performative tool for others to express themselves.
Sure.
One of the things that I really appreciate about Alicia is that you yourself are the performer. You were taking on this embodiment. It is something that I struggle to do. It's not my modality, even though I do it in my work. I don't have it's just not my mode. And I'm always so jealous and appreciative of people that do have that kind of specific mode. So with a lot of my work, a lot of it depends on how people participate and how people choose to use it.
Yeah.
Which is a little out of my control, and I'm okay with that.
No, I mean, here's hoping that we've all invested in GameStop, so
I mean,
collective action is really one way that we as individuals start to challenge these larger institutions. So I have one last question, and then we should open it up to save the last 10 minutes to open it up to the audience, in case there are some questions out there. But thinking about sort of the role of an installation for a video piece, especially Alicia for your project, looking at I know Adam was going around and Seneca was running around. They were all looking for signs to include. And all of the signs in the exhibition were once upon a time on somebody's lawn. And I actually think that that's incredibly important in this project to also understand, these are not, I think at one point we were sort of toying with the idea of printing out signs, but in many respects, I think it's super important that they were actually they're artifacts, I guess. So can you tell me a little bit about your desire to want to sort of bring that aspect of it?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and for everyone who ran around looking for signs. Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you so much. And it was interesting because it was something that I had been looking forward to doing before COVID, when I was going to spend time in Cleveland. And I think one part of that is how different there are no lawns in New York City. I live in the Bronx. There are houses, but no one puts campaign signs on their lawns. You rarely see anything on a window ever. me sometimes, and mostly when I see that, or when I have seen it, it's been in kind of affluent former bohemian neighborhoods, and I'm thinking specifically of like the West Village in Manhattan, which is downtown, or the East Village, which is formerly bohemian, as in the West Village, and now largely affluent. So maybe I would see like a tickle of a sign. So that was fascinating, that house and the structure of the lawn in itself being a type of stage for where the political discourse took place, and how elaborate some of the signs had become. They were like large-scale theatrical screens, and there was one photo that Adam sent to me actually, and it was huge. I don't know, it was like, I don't know, 8 feet. It was humongous. It was a movie screen, and it had 45 and his wife on either side of it. It was humongous, and that was that captured for me the performance of the moment and how it was playing out so intimately in people's homes.
Mm-hmm.
And then coupling that outside reality by the inside, and I think that's where the essential worker portraits come in, you know, and a lot of the issues that aren't really addressing the pain that workers are going through, working class. We're workers, but when we're talking about working class people who have been disenfranchised due to loss of work, and how that's not being looked at, you know, or addressed in a way that's substantial, was a point of trying to connect. How can we come to understand the political performances, this political stage, you know, politics is theater. How can we come to understand it outside of what's not real anymore? Mm-hmm. Because in a sense, when the candidates were talking and the whole campaign, it wasn't really capturing what people, the voters, were experiencing, and there was an aspect of escapism in it as well. I'll stop there.
No, that's totally beautiful, and I think that you know, it is kind of an interesting, like, Ohio, like, I think this is the first time in some crazy number of years that Ohio hasn't actually like voted for the person who won the election, because we are sort of like one of those classic swing states. And so it's actually been kind of interesting to sort of like explore that ideology and that sort of like experience. You know, I think I sort of have brought this metaphor up to Layla a couple times, but this idea that sort of like if cities are bubbles, it does feel like the membrane here is a little bit thinner, you know, like where the sort of, you know, conversation of, you know, the election was a lot more sort of a debate here.
Well, and mentioning that, it one of my other interests in having to spend time in Ohio has a lot to do with the second Bush steal of the election, where Ohio was the spot of what is it, missing votes, or
yeah,
the machine era.
It's always machines.
Ohio that changed the results of those of that election. Mm-hmm. Where, you know, the first time around it was Florida. So that was also an interesting point for me to just visit and meditate on, and thinking on and asking people about how they remembered that occurring, because it changed. All that led up to these last 4 years. Mm-hmm. When we're thinking of history in the 21st century, mm-hmm. we're well aware that all this has been centuries in the making.
That sort of brings us back to that earlier comment that you were making about Wendy, the Wendy Davis performance, that like even as Wendy Davis, you're adding all of this extra thick layer of like who you are and how, you know, people that look like you, that, you know, express like you, that emote like you, like that adds this other layer of like discussion. It's not just about the Planned Parenthood Center. It's also about, you know, the women at the border who are being forced sterilized. Like I think that that's such a really powerful way of thinking about it. So I do want to save, so we have 7 minutes left. I don't know how that happened. Is there any audience member who wants to share a question or has any questions for any of our brilliant artists? We would be happy to make some room here for that. And also, as we're doing that, Layla, if you could share in the chat, we do have a brief audience questionnaire that just helps us keep track of all of you and who you are, so that, you know, all of the, so for those of you who aren't super familiar, Spaces is free and open to the public. So you are, these questionnaires actually help us, you know, make sure that it stays that way and helps us internally record things. So if you are able to, please fill that out. And also, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. No questions? Oh. All right. No questions coming from our audience.
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Which is funny because I could have asked it at any point. Alicia, when you were editing your video, did anything change in your mind when the election results came out, like about how the video was being created, or were you still in early stages when you were creating the video?
You mean like in November?
Yeah.
Or, at that point I was still in early stages because I hadn't finished interviews. I had some like post-electoral interviews that I did and I scheduled on purpose, and those are the ones that you actually see the interviewee and me, and that was done on purpose, because all of the interviews were kept anonymous, except for 3 of them that we had agreed we would talk about post-election results, and you'll see them. One of them is Laura Rakovich, the other is Arlene Davila, and then Jahan Roberson, and they shared just really profound insights. A week, you know, trickled in a week after November 3rd. So I wouldn't. Yeah, so nothing changed because I was still in the planning part of it, and things were moving so quickly at such a rapid pace that it was very stimulating as an artist, because there was a lot of information coming in. And it was like, oh my God, how is that going to change the story? How is what so and so said going to change, or what images or what connections to mitigate or to intersect with what XYZ said? How is that going to change? Like that was, and thinking that some of the people I interviewed were seers, because the after effect of the election and what took place was very eloquently stated by many of the people that I talked to, you know, without our knowing. We were just, you know, interviewing and talking before any of this happened. So
it is, I mean, it's so impressive to me. It was like we could all feel it, something was going to go down. I'm so curious to see how this whole moment goes down in the books, because it does feel like very ominous. It was very sort of, yeah. Is there any other question from any members of our audience? We do have a question in the chats. I wonder for both artists, this is from Miss Megan Young, I wonder for both artists, where might these works go from here? So maybe we could start with Leo and then end with Alicia.
Such a good question, and of course Megan would be asking it. I honestly don't know. It's funny because the work is so speculative, but I haven't speculated on where it would go per se. I think for the immediate future, I would just like to see as many people participate as possible, and build up the archive on the website. I would love to be able to provide it as an archive with tags, so that people could use it as material, perhaps visit it and remix, if you will. But it's so funny. Ever since I started this, I was like, oh yeah, 45, and there have been so many other players in this drama that might need the same thing. So who knows what could happen.
A Rudy Giuliani filter sounds.
Yeah. I mean, yes. It might be kind of interesting, though. I mean, I'm fascinated by this technology, and Tizziana, you were talking about mimicry with Alicia, and I think one of the reasons that I like the Snapchat thing so much, the social media so much, specifically you were talking about like the lip sync is now this new digital craze, which comes from the ballroom scene in New York City. But like to some degree that idea of like creating a challenge, creating a lip sync, creating a thing, it's kind of like an embodied meme, if you will, right? Like a meme is like an image that is a cultural reference, right? And so this is like embodying that cultural reference, this project and all of those other types of things that you're talking about, the TikTok dances, the lip syncs. And there's something really, really powerful about that. There's something really powerful about this idea of like using a meme to embody a community of people into this one idea or action or something. And so maybe an expansion of that idea.
That's great. Alicia, do you have any last thoughts about where these works might go?
Well, we're having a watch party at some point.
Yes.
So stay tuned to Space's website on announcing the date. The Essential Workers has grown. It's a series of 20, so it'll be great to share those. In regards to like a venue where it'll be going next, we'll see. Open invitations, and then we'll just see. I'll keep everyone in the loop.
That's great. Thank you both. We have hit 1:01, just 1 minute over, but this has been incredibly wonderful. It's been so lovely to hear from both of you, and connect sort of the dots a little bit. It's one thing to see that works and sort of blind understand them, and another to sort of like hear the artists speak about what they've been doing and how they were sort of experiencing the moment. This is really wonderful. Thank you all, audience members alike, for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful Thursday afternoon, and we will all be in touch very soon. Yeah, that's all, folks. Bye.